Now we're getting ready to sew our sleeve lining together. Just as a reminder, if you've not cut your linings out yet, you will use the same pattern that you used for your jacket sleeve, which is number 12 and number 13. The difference is at the bottom, you'll notice that your cutting line for your lining is the line. It's about 7/8 of an inch up from the edge on the sleeve pattern. Let me fold that up so you can see. So this is the cutting line. You fold that under. So your lining sleeve, the upper and the under, are shorter than the actual sleeves in your jacket. And that's for hemming purposes. And I talked about that a little bit before. So just make sure that you have cut the linings on this shorter line, the second line up. Now, when I get ready to sew, you're going to notice I have both of my sleeves out here, my sleeve linings. I set up my left and my right sleeve at the same time. I find it much easier to make sure that I end up with a right sleeve and a left sleeve, especially with this lining fabric. As you can see, it's really hard to tell what's the right side and what the wrong side is. So if I sew my right sleeve and my left sleeve at the same time, I'm going to ensure that I have a right sleeve and a left sleeve and not two lefts or two rights. I have pinned the out seam on the sleeve. You want to make sure that you are marking up, and I'll show, it's easier to see on the pattern. You want to make sure you're matching up all the markings. There's a large circle on 12 and 13 that you want to match up, and there are double notches. Double notches tell us that that is the outside of the sleeve or the back of the sleeve. So I'm going to sew these out seams, press them, and then show you the next step. I've now stitched the out seam on my lining pieces, and I wanted to show you something. The out seam on the sleeve lining and on the sleeve curves outwardly, so I found that when I pressed it open over a hem. It had, as you can see, it lays really nicely on the curve. I felt that it pressed it better. I also did a few very small clips in the seam allowance. Now, normally, right, when your seam allowance is bigger at the cut edge than it is at the stitched edge, we do a notch. But the lining fabric is so thin, I don't really want to cut anything away, but I felt that it needed a little bit of a release. You can see right here and here, because it was going to make a little fold, and I didn't want that. So I did a tiny bit of clipping in this curve in the outer edge of the arm. There's nothing wrong with that. If it makes my finished product lay flatter and neater, that's all that really matters. So what I want to do next is I'm going to pin the front edge, the front seam on my sleeve. As you can see, here's the cap, here's the front edge, and I'm going to stitch that also at 5/8 of an inch. Then I will press it open. Now this one I will need to clip because this is an inward curve, right? It curves inward here, and in order for the seam allowance to be pressed open, we will need to release that seam allowance. So I'm going to stitch this, press it open, come back and show you, and then we'll talk about easing the cap. Now, your instructions in the pattern guide tell you to go ahead and sew the front seam and the back seam at the same time, which is perfectly fine. You can certainly do that. You will need a sleeve board, even on the second seam when you press it open. I just really felt that this back seam, because it curves so nicely, because when this is on your arm, it actually sits. Let me move this around to show you. It actually sits like this on our arm. And you can see that curve in the back. That's to allow for our elbow. And if I can press a nice curve into that, I'm going to do so. It's just a better finishing touch, quite frankly. So anyway, I'm going to go back now. I'm going to stitch the front seam. I'm going to press it open. And when I come back, we're going to talk about what we need to do to prepare the cap for the lining. So my sleeve lining is now sewn together. the front seam and the back seam. I've pressed my seams open. I've clipped as needed to release the seam allowance so it can lay flat. The next thing I want to do is put some easing threads in the top of my thread and do a little stay stitching. I will also go back and clip at the shoulder. So the marking at the very top of the shoulder is a large circle. I don't mark the large circle. I go ahead and just clip. That's going to be the part when I go to put my lining in. That's the part that matches up with the shoulder seam allowance. Your pattern also has two small circles marked here and here. In the pattern guide, they want you to put your easing stitches from small circle to small circle. That's what we're going to do on that's what we did on the sleeve, but on the sleeve lining, we're actually going to go further with this. So further down on each of my top of my sleeve, I have my single notch down here, I have my double notches here. And what I'm going to do is do an easing thread or gathering thread all the way from the single notch up through the cap down to the double notch. I'm going to do one at 5/8 of an inch or a scant 5/8 of an inch just inside the seam line. Then I'll do another one at 3/8. I always do 2 rows of easing threads because it just helps it helps ease the cap more evenly, quite frankly. And then I'm going to do a stay stitch on the bottom part of my sleeve lining. Now the stay stitch is to stabilize this area, right? It's on a curve, so it's very stretchy. We don't want to stretch it out. Your pattern guide tells you to start at 5/8, go to 3/8, and then back to 5/8. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea why they're telling you to do that. So I did not do that. So let me show you the sleeve that I have finished. Here's my sleeve lining. Then I have all the stitching on it that I just talked about. I have my notch at the top. That's where my large circle was. And you'll notice my easing threads or my gathering threads are all the way from my double notch up and around my sleeve cap down to my single notch. And I've left my tails, of course. I did the first one at 5/8 of an inch. Should be tiny bit inside of 5/8 of an inch, and then the second one is a 1/4 inch away, so at 3/8 of an inch. So that means that I'm ready when it comes time to put our sleeve cap in to ease this. The reason for doing the easing threads all the way down to the notches is not that we will ever really have gathers here. It's going to help us control the sleeve cap when we sew the sleeve lining in, because we will be doing that by hand. And then down here at the bottom, I changed to a permanent stitch length, and I did my stay stitch at the bottom. I did mine at a scant 5/8 of an inch, just because I want to secure the bottom of the sleeve at the armhole when it comes to put it in. So when you have all of this done, you have both of your sleeves finished, your sleeve linings finished. You're going to put them to the side because now you're finished with them. They'll be the last thing that we put into our jacket. So just know you have them done. Lay them neatly or hang them over a hanger. And you've now finished your sleeve linings.